It's a great privilege to be speaking at what is an extremely interesting time. In fact, things are moving so fast. I haven't quite caught up with the news from yesterday. And what is interesting, it's very hard to find the details of the cuts on either the Treasury or the Transport or Network Rail.
Oh, I rang the Department of Transport press office and they gave me a briefing and then they didn't give it to anybody else.
It's really visible. Christian, you're a man of immense pull. Nobody else gets it. Now, it's about improving the passenger experience, but there are some broader issues, and I'll be looking at passenger issues, but seeing them in the broader context of how we manage the railways in austerity. Now, everybody in this room is far too young except for me, but I was a child of the 50s, and there were a number of images from the 50s, of course, the trolley buses, which always seemed to be toppling over. Actually, this is an amazing accident. I can't see how a trolley bus can topple over. So it was obviously a very important day, and any 9-year-old looking at that would have run home and got his brother to have a look. Then there was the steam railway, which was never like the heritage we have today. In fact, it was a filthy, dirty railway most of the time, with staggeringly unreliable services, is my deep memory. But lastly, when one got home in the evening, on television, there was a somewhat improbable individual called the Lone Ranger, slightly camp, always beautifully turned out, with this very improbable Indian sidekick known as Tonto, if you remember. And we used to argue what Kimasabi meant. Now, don't go there. Now, the point about the Lone Ranger was, of course, everybody knows the Lone Ranger fired silver bullets from his revolver. And the silver bullets were always fired never to kill, but merely to desist the bad doing of some villain. And the point about being silver was, of course, being silver, they didn't damage you. You would heal. Now, what we need in this industry are silver bullets. And because we don't want to damage the industry by any further change. There's been a huge amount of it in the last 10, 15 years. Much of it has been fundamentally crazy. And we now need to go back to a system where we get the systems and processes right, firing the right silver bullets. In my view, organisation and structure then follows. Now, here's a man. Does anybody know who this guy is? No, it's fascinating. This is Sir Alan Budd. And this is a man which many of you are going to be extremely frightened of in the next few months, because he is the chairman of the Office of Budget Responsibility, who's working for Osborne and Law to create a structure of accounting and management of government liabilities, which I think is going to bring the railway into particularly strong focus. And I'll come back to that when I talk about Network Rail in a minute. But we are going to be working in a time when I think there's going to be some very hard-headed economic and operational approaches. Now, the first of my silver bullets is pleasing passengers. And I do think we as a railway industry has got to change the terms of trade. A number of points. We're dealing with people who are exactly in the same category in the train operators as the people on the bottom row of It Ain't Half Hot Mum. And if you remember, the people who sit in the bottom row are the government contractors. Now, these are actually rather good government contractors. And what worries me about the train operating companies is, although they are exceptionally good government contractors, they've got the relationship with government right as they see it. I fear that passengers often get squeezed in the process because passengers are not perceived as the primary customers of train operating companies. Now, how are we going to please passengers? First of all, we need real passengers' charters. Now, you can go on the website and you can find passengers' charters. And curiously enough, the apostrophe is always before the S. There's only one passenger the charter's for. They are very grudging documents. They're the minimum you can get away with. None of them, I may be wrong, and somebody can stand up and say they've seen a passenger's charter, which is really, really different. But most of them are formulaic, and they basically aren't charters at all. They're the minimum that the operator thinks they can get away with to meet the ORR and the DFT's requirements. I think a really, really important part of the process would be to get into instantaneous refunds for fares when services are not working. Now, there was a fascinating series of advertisements. I've never been able to find a copy of it. When the Seville to Madrid high-speed line, the AVE, opened, and they have a cast iron guarantee that any service that arrives 10 minutes late at either Madrid or Seville, that all passengers receive an immediate and instantaneous refund. And the advertisement on television showed a carriage of the Ave and the passengers all looking extremely worryingly at their watches. And the train pulls into Madrid, and it's 1 second past the 10-minute barrier, and the whole carriage erupts cheering. Now, an operator that sells its services like that is one that I would follow almost the ends of the earth. And I just wish we could have a structure like that in the United Kingdom. Interesting enough, there was an operator, GB Rail, which ran the Anglia franchise in the late 90s, early 2000s, that did have systems of instantaneous refunds to season ticket holders. On void days, they got their money back, or a proportion of it. Unfortunately, Anglia was not a very profitable operation. East Anglian Railways rarely are, I fear. But the other operators kept well away from it. But I think that sort of treatment of passengers would be infinitely better than the present system. If you try and get a refund, you have to fill in a form, you send it off, you might get a voucher back. The whole process is designed to make it very difficult for you to be compensated for poor service. And it's that sort of thing which I think could fundamentally change the terms of trade. I'd also like to see much more work on what's called intelligent infrastructure, which I've done quite a bit of work on. This is the fact that most of us have now in our pockets bits of machinery that actually have immense power to communicate and to pass information around. And I just wish the operators would, and some of them are doing quite well, but it's not enough. And I think we're at the stage now where operators could begin to interact with individual customers to a much greater degree than they do at present. And then I do think there has to be a real sense of who's in charge of looking after passengers. I am actually a bit worried that in the joint coalition manifesto, it talks about turning the ORR into a real passengers champion. I think that's going to be a meaningless statement. I think the regulator's got an important job to do. It's a grindingly unexciting one, but it's getting the industry to run economically better. I don't think it's about passengers. And I think that passenger focus must step up to the plate, but probably much more than it does now. I know you have a passenger focus speaker later today, but passenger focus has got to make a real decision. Well, there's a government-funded body that it's got to be a really doughty fighter for passengers, and I think it should be turning up at Phil Hammond's office saying, give me the job. Don't let the ORR do it, because the ORR's got enough to do in the next few months and years. And it must be there must be a clear focus of who's going to lead this big pressure on the train operating companies. Now, the next bullet, the second of the three, is openness and transparency, understanding the business we are in. And quite frankly, the opacity of the present railway system, where there's literally billions of pounds of government subsidies swirling around it, is actually quite difficult to follow. If you are prepared to work extremely hard and delve deep into ORR documents, you can actually find out quite a bit. You certainly won't find out very much from Network Rail's published material, and the train operating companies, for obvious reasons, don't reveal a great deal about their specific railway businesses, or enough information that gives you an understanding of how the business works. Now, I think I'd like to concentrate this section on Network Rail because it really is the heart of the problem. This is just a bar chart that shows you in billions. Remember, we deal in large figures in the railway industry, and the left-hand line goes up to, it goes to 8 billion at the top, and 7 is the next one down, is what Network Rail are planning to spend, have planned to spend from 04-05 through to the end of control period 4, which ends in 13-14. Stonking great sums of money, and quite frankly, although towards the end of the period of control period 4, it starts to come down, it's taken a hell of a long time to get there. And the 100 million yesterday, of course, isn't even identifiable on this bar chart. It's such a tiny amount. It's a sliver on the top.